Today we're looking at an older theory which has fallen out of favour, called the Swoon Theory. Its technical name is the apparent death theory, or to quote the Princess Bride,
well, it just so happens that your friend here is only mostly dead. There's a big difference between mostly dead and all dead.
This theory goes that Jesus merely passed out on the cross. He fell unconscious or fell into a coma and only appeared dead, and that was why it seemed like he died so quickly, but he wasn't really dead. After all, doctors sometimes make mistakes in this area, pronouncing someone dead who hasn't died, so surely the soldiers could have done the same. So Jesus is then wrapped and put into the tomb, only unconscious in this coma, and in the coldness of the tomb he revives, and on Easter Sunday, rejuvenated, he comes out of the tomb and he appears to his disciples and shows himself alive, and they all think that he's risen from the dead. So this is the Swoon Theory. Does it fit the facts? Well, the first thing to notice is that there's only one record in all of history of someone surviving crucifixion. This is recorded in Josephus, where 3 men were pardoned while they hung on the cross. They'd only been on the cross a brief while. They were taken down from the cross. They then received immediate medical treatment, and one man survived, although his other 2 fellows actually still died of their injuries. So this would be an extremely unlikely occurrence, especially considering the full nature of what Jesus had gone through with the scourging and the full process of crucifixion. It also fails to take into account that Jesus was killed by professional executioners. Their one job was to make sure that their prisoners died. And in Roman law, the punishment for failing to carry out the full capital sentence on someone sentenced to death was that you yourself would be put to death. And so it was these soldiers who took Jesus down from the cross, and at the moment they took him down, they would have checked whether he was really dead. This theory also fails to take into account the true nature of the injuries from scourging and crucifixion. It underestimates the true nature of these injuries. Now, in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1986, a medical pathologist has written a report on dying by scourging and crucifixion, which you can look into for yourself. We also now have archaeological evidence of finding bones of people who have been crucified and can study the nature of the wounds and the injuries that they received. Remember, Jesus had first been scourged, and scourging inflicted massive amounts of tissue damage. The skin, blood vessels and underlying musculature were ripped open by the flagellum. Sometimes even the underlying organs were exposed, and there would be a huge amount of trauma and loss of blood, and so much so that this was sometimes called the half-death. Now, if these injuries were left untreated with this extent of wounds to the body, the patient is unlikely to survive without medical treatment. And then comes the crucifixion itself. And remember, the very purpose of crucifixion was to weaken the victim in extreme pain over hours and days, so that eventually they could no longer push themselves up to breathe, and they would then die of asphyxiation or of heart failure. So that the whole purpose of this method of death was that the victim was put into such a position that breathing was extremely difficult, as their arms were stretched open wide and as they were hanging down with their weight on their arms, and they could barely exhale. And so to take in each new breath, they had to push up against the injuries to their feet nailed to the cross, pull against the nails in their hands or wrists, take that breath, and then sink back down again until they could gather enough strength to take the next breath. Now, this whole theory is based on the fact that Jesus falls unconscious. Now, as soon as you fall unconscious, the body sags, you no longer push up against your legs and your arms in order to breathe, you then die of asphyxiation. So this swoon theory, this passing out of Jesus to try and explain away his death, actually falls into the problem that this is the very thing that killed you when you were being crucified. And this was why Jesus' legs were not broken, because he was already dead. The two other criminals crucified either side had their legs broken and therefore couldn't push up to breathe. Jesus, already unconscious, it's the same thing. He couldn't push up to breathe and therefore would die of asphyxiation within just moments, minutes of that happening. So it doesn't explain away the death. It actually causes the death. And then, of course, you've got the spear to the thorax. The soldiers, surprised that he had died as quickly as he had, to make sure that he really had died, gave him a death wound, which was to ram a Roman spear into his thorax. And we read blood and water poured out. Now, blood and water, this mixture of clear liquid and blood, would happen either because they had pierced his pericardium, the sac of his heart, and pericardial fluid was coming out mixed with the blood, in which case it's a fatal wound to the heart, or if it was puncturing the lung, it would indicate that the lungs had filled with fluid due to the asphyxiation. In either case, he's dead, and this blood and water indicates that. But even if that were not the case, this spear wound has now caused a pneumothorax. It has pierced the lung area, and so now what would happen is the lung would collapse and would in itself cause a death by asphyxiation if left untreated. So he's wrapped, he's put in the tomb, he's supposed to revive, but with this pneumothorax, if he wasn't already dead, his lungs would collapse and he would suffocate from this injury itself. So all of this shows that it doesn't fit the facts of death by crucifixion. And even skeptical scholars like David Strauss from the 1800s, who was a liberal scholar who himself didn't believe in the resurrection, he wrote against this theory. And he pointed out the implausibility of Jesus rolling then the stone away from the inside of the tomb. This stone would weigh well over a ton. And Jesus single-handedly rolled it back from the inside when man alone couldn't roll it on the outside. He would have the piercing and decimation of his median nerves in the palm of his hand from the nails going in to his wrists, which would mean that his hands would be paralyzed. So how could he roll back the stone? And think of how weakened and emaciated he would be from all these injuries that he sustained. He'd barely be able to stand, let alone roll back a ton weight stone. He'd then have to get past the Roman guard or overpower the Roman guard or somehow escape without them seeing. He'd have to then walk on feet which were crushed by these iron spikes having been driven through them, usually through the heels, so the heel bones themselves would have been fractured by these large metal spikes being driven through, and yet he had to walk from the tomb back into Jerusalem. And then he turns up naked to all of his disciples. You just picture the scene, how weak he would be, how dehydrated, how gory and covered in blood he would be, probably in nervous shock from all the injuries that he'd received. And then he appears to his disciples in that state and says, "I'm the Lord of life." And they're to believe that he's the risen Jesus who's conquered death and now lives in a glorified body. It just doesn't fit the facts. Let alone him saying, with these terrible injuries to hands and feet and spear wound to the side, "Come, touch my hands. Put your hands on my side." That's the last thing he'd want to do with all these open wounds still untreated. So you see that it doesn't fit the facts of the crucifixion. It doesn't fit the facts of the empty tomb. It doesn't fit the facts of the appearances to the eyewitnesses. And this is why no modern scholar holds this view anymore. No contemporary resurrection debates use this as an argument against the resurrection anymore, because the swoon theory that Jesus hadn't really died has died itself.